In 1840, the World Anti-Slavery Convention is held in London. Some of the most influential people and policymakers from across the globe gather in order to discuss the future of abolitionism. However, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott are both barred from attending. Just like that, one of the most paramount movements in the history of America has been set into motion.
The women's suffrage movement aimed to ultimately provide women with the same amount of rights as men at the time period. However, the movement was largely a failure prior to the Civil War. At least part of the reason that this occurred was because the majority of Americans were focused on a different issue: abolition. The history of the women's suffrage movement is deeply entangled with that of slavery. As abolitionism gained supporters, so did the women's suffrage movement, as the idea became that all people, regardless of race and gender, should gain equality.
This theme was perhaps best exemplified at the first National Women's Rights Convention, where prominent speakers and abolitionists like Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison attended and vouched for women's rights. This gave the Women's Rights Conventions huge amounts of legitimacy and support, and allowed them to garner far more supporters than they could have by themselves. However, though more supporters did join the movement, the vast majority of men failed to recognize it as a whole, leading to stagnation in its overall progress. In fact, many women that supported the movement were even instituted in mental hospitals for doing so, as demanding rights was not seen to be womanly. Further progress was also restricted due to the fact that all progress made at both the Seneca Falls as well as the first National Women's Rights Convention wasn't accepted by the national government. This was because none of these bodies had the power to pass and uphold legislation.
However, as put in the book Defining Moments, Women's Suffrage, the purpose of these conventions was not to make laws, but rather to focus public attention on women's rights and spur further action. The conventions proved very successful on both counts. Thus, though the conventions had failed on the broader scheme of providing women more rights, they attracted far more attention to the cause and brought it into the public radar. In fact, in 1849, about 1 year after the first National Women's Rights Convention, the state of California became the first in the nation to extend private property rights to women. Further, in 1852, Clara Nichols presented the issue and the idea of women's private property rights to Vermont, which was ultimately rejected. Thus, even though measures had been taken to attempt to grant women more rights, they were ultimately shot down throughout this time period.
Because of this, both the Seneca Falls Convention and the First National Women's Rights Convention acted more like pivoting events rather than fundamental shifts in the women's rights movement. The failure of these conventions to materialize and produce tangible results led to a fundamental shift in the goal of the movement. Women were now focused on adding in a constitutional amendment to allow for women to have the same rights as men. A constitutional amendment, leaders in the movement argued, would ensure that women could make a permanent mark in their nation's history in an irreversible manner. The problem, however, was that both of these events, the Seneca Falls Convention and the First National Women's Rights Convention, were and continue to be presented in a manner that makes them seem crucial to the movement as a whole. As explained above, these conventions were a way for the movement to change its focus and try different ways to spread their goals and hopefully accomplish them. This view, however, is not shared by many modern-day sources who claim that these conventions were a huge step in women's suffrage. This claim is made clearly in a video by History.com shown in the following video.
At the convention, they read the Declaration of Sentiments, a document drafted by Stanton and modeled after the Declaration of Independence, declaring, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." The sentiments outlined the civil and political rights denied to American women, which included education, property ownership, child custody in the event of a divorce, and most importantly, the right to vote. On the second day of the convention, 12 resolutions were passed and signed by 68 women and 32 men.
In fact, the women's suffrage movement actually led to a lot of negative backlash towards women's rights via the governments of several different states. According to the book, a timeline of American women's history, the state of Tennessee actually passed a bill that restricted women from claiming property of their own, with the body collectively claiming married women lack independent souls, and thus they shouldn't be allowed to own their own private property.
Thus, the women's suffrage movement had several lasting impacts after the Civil War, like, for example, the right to vote being established and extended to women being able to work alongside men, and, in general, the recognition that women had rights that were equal to those of men. Throughout this time period, in antebellum America, the women's suffrage movement wasn't as effective as it is currently made out to be. While they succeeded in garnering more support prior to the Civil War, they failed to give women any rights outside of the right to own property in California. Even with the backing of influential speakers, upstanding and outspoken women, and the aid of thousands across the nation, the women's suffrage ultimately just couldn't succeed in the climate and time period of antebellum America.